All right, so it looks like we are met. Again, I'm Jen Dees, Programs Manager at PEN America Los Angeles, an organization that unites writers and readers to celebrate creative expression and defend the liberties that make it possible. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for a conversation featuring Art Cullen, the Pulitzer-prize-winning editor of a local paper working tirelessly to continue its service to the rural town of Storm Lake, Iowa. The important story of the Storm Lake Times is a bellwether for our moment, with implications for local outlets across the country, outlets that we cannot afford to lose if we hope to sustain an informed citizenry. The paper is profiled in a new documentary, which airs tonight on PBS at 7 p.m. Pacific. Check your listings. And PEN America has also been sounding the alarm about the loss of local news outlets for years, recently publishing a report on this issue titled Losing the News, the decimation of local news and the search for solutions, which I will link to in the chat. The documentary Storm Lake was created by the award-winning documentary filmmakers Beth Levison and Jerry Risius with us today, who are also celebrating some great wins, including the premiere this evening. We're very excited for them. We're also here with PEN America's Program Director of Digital Safety and Free Expression, Viktorya Vilk, who worked on that local news report, as well as VP of the Society of Professional Journalists of Greater Los Angeles, Ashanti Blaize-Hopkins. Our conversation will be followed by a Q&A, so be thinking of your questions, and please drop them in the Q&A box as they come to you, and we'll get to those during our last 15 minutes or so together. Thank you for joining us again, and help me welcome Art, Beth, Jerry, Viktorya, and Ashanti.
All right, thank you so much for attending today. I know it's in the middle of the day, so I'm sure a lot of you may be eating lunch while you're listening and watching to us, so we appreciate you being here. I did want to start out by allowing Beth and Jerry to share some really great news that they just got from the Hollywood Reporter about Storm Lake. Can you guys share what you just heard about an hour ago before this even started?
Go ahead, Beth.
Well, don't hold me to it because I haven't even fully read the article yet. I just know that we were listed as one of the top films in awards contention this year on the documentary side. So we are contending for some awards. So just to be on that list and in the company of the other films is really amazing and exciting. So I have to read it thoroughly, but I know we're on the list.
That's the important thing. You're on the list. I think that this documentary is really amazing. So it's no surprise that you guys are already getting some, award buzz around it. I want to start by asking the two of you, why did you decide to make this film in the first place? And kind of what were your hopes of the impact that it would make?
I can certainly start, Ashanti, with the genesis of this. I am an Iowan. I was born and raised on a small pig farm, actually, but maybe an hour and a half or so away from Art and Storm Lake, and I still pay attention to all things Iowa, and of course read journalism and read newspapers and pay attention to journalism. And so when the Pulitzers were announced in the spring of 2017, I saw that the headline read "Small North Iowa newspaper wins Pulitzer," and I had to do a couple of double takes before I realized actually that it read "Small North Iowa newspaper." So I immediately read the articles. I looked up Art. I looked up what his work had been actually concentrating on, and then I reached out to him, and we had a long conversation. I asked him about coming out to Storm Lake to do actually a profile character reel. And we immediately connected on all things Iowa. I think we share a mutual sort of inferiority complex of being born in Iowa and spending most of our lives trying to explain that, no, we don't grow Idahos, or we don't grow potatoes there. And then I went out and spent the afternoon with him in that fall. And we then I spent a couple of months editing something together, and Beth and I, who actually we worked together at the School of Visual Arts in an MFA program where we both teach, and I was eventually able to convince her, although in her very busy schedule, to come along and help. And once she joined the film, then really things took off.
Beth, let me ask you this. Was there anything that you learned in the process of making this film that really just surprised you about local news, about the Storm Lake Times, about the industry in general? Can you share?
Yeah, there was a lot that surprised me and that continues to surprise me. When we first started filming, we thought it would be really a story about art. And then the more we started filming, it quickly became apparent that it was a story about a family, and it would be an ensemble film. And then as soon as art started really proselytizing that a community is only as healthy as its newspaper, and a newspaper is only as healthy as its community, I think then at that juncture, we started to really understand that this film is about more than a family, more than a newspaper, and also a community. And I think the first big surprise was understanding the relationship between those two things, a community and a newspaper. And that was really powerful. And then there was our deepening understanding. I mean, I think that when I first started this project, in full candor, I mean, I thought that I didn't really understand the relationship between local news and an informed citizenry and a functioning democracy. And I think that's totally something that, whether it was like an immediate surprise or a realization over time, it's somewhere in that realm. And I think, a surprise now is just, it's just been fascinating to see how, and not great, but like how urgent this subject has become. The response to the film has been really wonderful, but I think part of that response also comes out of urgency. And it's interesting to see the state of local news and how much it's struggling, and how little most Americans understand that at all. So here's this national crisis sort of unfolding right under our nose, and yet most of us aren't even seeing it. And so whether that's a surprise, it's certainly, again, it's been a real realization, and just, it's something that's really come out of the making of the project.
Art, I would love to ask you, I know your brother's the one that kind of started the Storm Lake Times to begin with, and then it became this family business, as both Jerry and Beth explained as part of their answer. When you think about the beginnings of the Storm Lake Times and what it meant to the community, take me through how that has evolved, what we saw in the documentary, and then what it looks like now.
John started the newspaper in 1990 because there was a chain-owned newspaper here that wasn't really doing the job, in his opinion. And so he started up his own newspaper. I came in about 3 months later. I'd been an editor at a daily newspaper in Northern Iowa, not right near Jerry's hog farm in Mason City. And it was a corporate-owned newspaper, a chain newspaper itself, where I was working, and I was really fed up with kind of the corporate newspaper thing. And so I went home and helped John start this paper. And it was we hoped to live up to the motto, Buena Vista County's hometown newspaper, and that was our only ambition. And then it evolved. We went daily for a year, lost about $100,000. Started out as a weekly, went daily for a year. Then went back to twice a week many years ago. I can't even remember what year it was. And we've been there ever since. We're about 3,000 circulation, paid circulation. And we won a Pulitzer Prize in 2017 for editorial writing based on water quality. And we've kind of always been devoted to the idea of, since we're, live on a lake, we're very attuned to water quality and agriculture and how those two intersect. And that's what won us the Pulitzer and caught Jerry's attention.
It's interesting because Storm Lake is a very diverse town in a state that you would not think of diversity, right? So
Right.
even watching the documentary, I think I was a little shocked with how rich and diverse the folks that live there were, and how it seems that that is the driving force to a lot of the storytelling that comes out of the Storm Lake Times. It seems that community papers are very important to especially smaller communities and more diverse communities, and losing that is an issue. Can we speak a little bit about, Art, you first, and then Viktorya, I'd love for you to jump in, about how Storm Lake is kind of a paradigm of what's happening across the country. You know, we talked a little about news deserts in the documentary and what that means. Can you share a little bit about how the Storm Lake Time mirrors what is happening across the country? Art, maybe start with you, and then Viktorya, if you could jump in.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things about Storm Lake is its rapid diversification since about 1990. Actually, it started in 1980 when the state of Iowa invited the entire Thai Dam culture to come from Thai refugee camps, and they were boat people, and we transplanted the entire culture from Thailand to Iowa, and two beachheads were Des Moines and Storm Lake. And so hence Storm Lake has this gorgeous gold leaf Buddhist temple sitting next to a ready mix concrete plant. You know, and it's that kind of community. Very interesting place. 90% of our elementary children are children of color, mainly immigrant, and mainly Latino. But about 23 languages are spoken in our schools. And so that's happening across the Midwest. Garden City, Kansas, Dodge City, Kansas, where Miss Kitty once held forth, is now majority Latino. And, you know, there's a world changing out here, and a new world is beginning, and we're chronicling that. We've gone from a Swedish Lutheran community to a Latino, Sudanese, Laotian community that's entirely different than what my parents knew, or what I knew growing up. When we had one college athlete at Buena Vista who was African American, Furman Rentz, 6'3", from White Plains, New York, could go to the hoop like nobody in the Iowa Conference. And we had one Jewish eye doctor. That was diversity in Storm Lake. If a Catholic married a Lutheran, it was a big deal.
So, you know, Viktorya, I know that PEN America just released this Losing the News report, and a lot of it spoke about how smaller communities that are very diverse are being strongly impacted by the shuttering of local community news media outlets, right? So I know specifically it mentioned Detroit, Denver, and 2 specific counties in North Carolina. Can you talk a little bit about how Storm Lake kind of mirrors some of the information that you found in the report that PEN America put together?
Absolutely. First of all, I'm absolutely delighted to be here. Second of all, as someone who came to this country as a refugee, as a child, it's like music to my ears to hear the ways in which places like Storm Lake are changing. But to answer your question, so we started out when we were working on our report, we thought we were going to write about news deserts, and we thought, well, there are parts of the country that don't have, local newspapers or local journalism anymore, and that's what we're going to write about. And what we were really startled and concerned about is that we realized this is happening all over the country, including in major cities, including it's not just a rural issue, it's not just a city issue, it's the entire country. And so the this that I'm talking about is that what we're seeing is local journalism outlets, particularly local papers, shrinking and shuttering all over the country at breakneck speed. And the reason that that's happening is that there's essentially been a market failure, because we know that investigative reporting is actually quite costly to produce, right? The kind of watchdog journalism that Art does that you need costs money. And we used to pay for that with ad revenue. And that's still how we're paying for it, except that giant companies like Facebook and Google are so good at selling our private data and selling ads that they've actually siphoned the vast majority of the revenue that used to sustain local journalism into something else. And so the primary source of money for local papers has started to, well, not started, for 15 years now has been taken. And what that means is we have lost in the last 15 years, well over 2,000 local papers. Newspapers have lost 50% of staff, and that was before the pandemic. During the pandemic, tens of thousands of reporters across the country either lost their jobs or had to take pay cuts or work fewer hours. And many of the papers that are left are so-called ghost papers, where they have so little funding that they're essentially producing almost no accountability reporting. And the reason that matters is that we actually have to think about journalism as an ecosystem, right? It's newspapers, TV, radio, social media, where a lot of this stuff is now circulating, and it's local, state level, and national level. But newspapers are actually the keystone species, as they're called, in the ecosystem, because they still produce the bulk of that kind of watchdog investigative reporting that holds governments and corporations accountable. So when you lose newspapers and you lose reporters on the ground, you're losing that ability to actually understand what's happening in a community, to keep the community informed. And so that is what really, really concerns us as a free expression organization that defends a free and independent press, about what's happening at the local and national level to local papers.
I thought it was interesting, Art, in the course of the documentary, your son started to talk about, okay, here are some innovative ways I think that maybe we could turn this around, right? Maybe a podcast. And you were like, whoa, hold up. we don't do that, right? But can you talk about some of the innovative ways that you were able to think about the future of the Storm Lake Times, getting other partners involved, different things that you were doing digitally, to make sure that the Storm Lake Times would be around for the community in years to come?
Yeah, well, first of all, Tom is actually going to be introducing a podcast soon, and I'm not involved in it
Were you
yet.
down?
Yeah. But what
Awesome.
I was trying to say is that in the movie is that we don't want to do anything that distracts us from reporting. And the more things and that's the real challenge. We're devoting all our resources to this print edition newspaper, and then we're trying to put out a digital product with our left hand. No offense to left-handed people, and we don't have the resources or the know-how to really transform into this new medium that involves video, audio, and print, the written word, and it's going to take a younger generation to make that transition. And my brother John and I are both on Social Security, and so it's going to be up to Tom to make this flip. It's up to me to get enough capital raised, because it's very good digital. We put out a tremendous print edition, and that is expensive, and it's also very expensive to put out a digital product that mirrors that print edition. And the print edition is necessary for our elderly demographic, so we can't just abandon print. And that's why we're trying to raise money through the Western Iowa Journalism Foundation, which we created, a nonprofit foundation earlier this year with about 5 other newspapers to help these independent family-owned newspapers make that transition. We can become a lot better than we currently are, and we can evolve into all sorts of new ways to tell stories innovatively. I'd love to have the money to hire Jerry Risius to come in and do some video with me, but we could do those kind of things if we only can raise the money, as Viktorya illustrated earlier, because of this plundering of our advertising-based model. And so we got to switch to a donor-based model that can provide for those needs.
I would love, Viktorya, kind of off of what Art just talked about and what they've been doing in Iowa, if you can talk a little bit about some of the suggestions that came out of the report, some of the things that you would like to see happen from the federal level, from the state level, from the local level, to try and protect local news media outlets and make sure that they are able to continue, that they are still informing the electorate, that they are still the foundation of our democracy. Can you talk a little bit about some of those findings?
Sure. So I would say the two biggest challenges that are facing us, the challenges we have to solve are one, that the primary funding source, which is ad revenue, has dissipated, right? It's been siphoned off by Facebook, Google, and other social media platforms. It's actually $35 billion has been lost in the sort of media ecosystem in the last 15 years, which is a big gap, right? There's that. And then the other problem is consolidation. And this is actually, Art was talking about this, and he was talking about working for a big corporate conglomerate newspaper. The problem is that because of the financial crisis facing journalism, more and more and more local outlets are getting bought up by enormous corporate conglomerates. And the thing that's bad about that is that they are often run by hedge funds nowadays. And the only priority of those hedge funds is to make a profit. And so what they do is they gut local papers, squeeze as much money out of them as they can, and then flip them and sell them. And that also means that if, let's say, 3 companies almost own almost every TV station in the country, you're going to get journalism. If you get any original journalism at all, you're going to get journalism that is a lot less local, a lot less diverse, and often a lot more politically polarized. So we have to solve those two problems. And in the report, we were basically arguing that the crisis has risen to such a point that it's an all hands on deck kind of situation. So what we need is we need an influx of money back into the system, right? So we need way more private funding. And when I say private funding, I mean things like foundations, philanthropy, billionaires are buying papers. That's not a bad thing, but if your billionaire doesn't want you to write about the corporate corruption that they're doing, that's a less good thing. So that's one place, but we also actually need to rethink journalism in this country as a public good. We've always thought of it purely as a market product, right? Does the market support local journalism? But actually, it is a public good. If we want local government to be held accountable, if we want civic engagement to be encouraged for people to vote, to know who to vote for, to know what positions their local candidates occupy, we actually have to be able to support that in some way as a public good. And so, I mean, I can get into more detail about what that would look like and what it would mean and the risks of doing something like that, but that's the kind of main argument. And we need government organizations like the FTC and the FCC to actually push back against some of this massive corporate consolidation that has been happening for decades that no one is stopping or doing anything to curb.
This definitely seems like a very much a stronger together situation, especially with these smaller organizations like the Storm Lake Times. They can't do it alone. So being able to come together with a couple of different other media organizations to figure out a way to fundraise and to get that capital that's needed, I think is going to be critical going forward to protect local news in our country. One of the things I think that a lot of people who are not in the industry maybe are hearing this for the first time are thinking, well, how can I help? What can I do as someone who is a member of the public? Viktorya, can you share some of the things that the public can do to help this in this situation?
Absolutely, and I would love if Art has thoughts on that too, I'd love to hear them. But okay, the simplest thing is support your local paper. I think we have gotten to a point where we totally take for granted the production of really high quality local journalism. And there's very, very good studies that have shown that even though Americans actually prefer and trust and value local media more than national media, they have absolutely no idea that it's in financial trouble. And so they just assume it's going to keep getting produced, except that it won't if you don't pay for it. So paying for your local paper or paying for whatever local sources of journalism you value is really, really important. But also, and forgive me, I'm in our office for the first time in almost 2 years. It's very noisy today. But the other issue is to actually talk to your state and local elected officials about the fact that you are worried about what happens when there is no local journalism happening in your community anymore, and pushing to have public funding or public support or tax credits. I mean, there are many different ways of doing this. And we're seeing that happening in Colorado and Massachusetts, in Ohio. There are states where the local population is advocating to have the state actually support local journalism, but it's not happening across the country yet. So those would be the two places I would start. But Art, what do you think?
Well, yeah, and Beth has really been the great evangelist because, as she often points out, newspapers are lousy at telling their own stories, and and she's always telling the crowds where we go to screenings, you know, are you advertising in your local paper? Are you subscribing to your local paper? Blocking and tackling, you know. There are places to support. The Seattle Times has a nonprofit foundation. The Lenfest Institute helps fund the Philadelphia Inquirer. The Western Iowa Journalism Foundation that we started has raised about $300,000 so far. And that sounds like a lot of money, but you know, that's half our annual revenue. And that's to support 5 different newspapers. So, you know, we got a long ways to go. We're having some productive conversations with some of the outfits that disrupted our business model, like, you know, Microsoft and Google and Facebook. But, you know, my question is that worries me is how long it's kind of a hot topic right now because, you know, a half dozen newspapers in Iowa have closed since the pandemic, including one of the oldest in the state, the Centerville Daily Iowegian. Now, we can't afford to lose that title, but we did. And so my question is, how long will that philanthropic support last? And I believe that we need to get to some sort of a market-based solution because I don't trust the government to fund newspapers. They said they were going to give us postal subsidies and they just raised them 9% this year. So I don't think we can count on the government. I think the only people we can count on for our supper is readers. But I'm open to persuasion.
Beth, I would love to hear, you know, from your perspective as a filmmaker, how important, you know, documentaries like Storm Lake are to making sure that people do understand that this is mission critical, that this is not something that is going to fix itself. So can you speak to how important it is to have made something like Storm Lake?
Well, I think it's really important that we made Storm Lake. I think exactly as Viktorya was saying, I think that we have started to just take our local news for granted. We have just begun to believe that it will always be there, and it won't be if we don't take care of it. And, you know, people in their communities, like, they want to support their local coffee shop and they patron it. Well, we have to support our local newspapers. But I think that the broadcast and the distribution is really important. But I think the other way in which documentaries have real value is when they can have an impact campaign. And we have been so fortunate to have the support to have an impact campaign, a national impact campaign that, you know, we pair with national partners like PEN America, and then we work with newspapers on the ground. And so I think that that's been really important. It has allowed us, wherever we've screened, we've partnered with a local newspaper, a local journalist, so that the local news outlets can tell their story to their community, and we can foster dialogue and understanding and nurture support. These conversations are so important. And you know, there are even, you know, there are other things that we're doing. So, you know, for folks who are motivated by the film, we are encouraging them to support their local news source through Newsmatch, which is a program with INN, the Institute for Nonprofit News. And actually this month, there's a match. So if somebody supports their local news source, that local news source gets double. So yeah, I think that documentaries are excellent at raising awareness. And I think the one thing that we really want to do is encourage action. And again, whether it's subscribing, if you're a local business owner and you can support your local newspaper with ads, and even just encouraging people to engage with their local newspaper, read it, talk about what they read, encourage someone else to read it because it was a good article and it got them thinking. You know, these are all ways that we keep local news alive and vital in our communities.
Jerry, do you feel like what you've created in Storm Lake is going to begin a conversation that can potentially put us on a track to better help local news media outlets?
I certainly hope so. I think you know, throughout this conversation, we've talked about what that evolution has been, and certainly, we're at a bit of a tipping point, and certainly, Art can speak to, the history of what he's gone through, but, having the newspapers being bought, by hedge funds, or being constantly absorbed into larger, in our world of capitalism, I guess I can say that, things either have to get big or you have to get out, whether you're a farmer or whether you're a newspaper, owner. So, I think what we're trying to do is shine a light on local journalism, and certainly on local news sources, bring awareness up to the public, to make certain that they know what's happening. And this film does that. I think it does it through a sort of a micro view of one newspaper, one family, one community. And I believe that a lot of what Art and his family go through are universal sort of touchstones that people around the country, and I believe also around the world, can relate to. So I'm certainly hopeful that this can spawn that sort of conversation.
Beth and Jerry, do you see yourselves making other documentaries that are similar to Storm Lake for other local papers across the country? Or just like a one-off, like, wait a minute, we can help you do this, but
I would say, we certainly aren't there yet, but I would love nothing more than to do more of this. This has been a dream for us, because we fell in love and fell in stride with the Cullens, and believed what they were doing. And along the way, we also learned so much just about what was happening. As we're filmmakers, we're not journalists, but we certainly do cross over in many of our whatever our work is together. And so, I think it's still very open. We would love to, but I don't think that there's anything really in the books yet.
I would love to take a moment to get a couple of people who have put some questions in the Q&A section. Alejandra asks, can you talk about Storm Lake's relationship to Spanish language readers? So Art, that probably is going to go to you.
Yeah, it's been very challenging for us. We've tried Spanish language editions before, and one of the problems is literacy, and that a lot of our neighbors come from rural Mexico, where they might have the benefit of only a third-grade education. So they're functionally illiterate in Spanish, much less English. But the next generation coming up, they're graduating from our local community college. They're graduating from Buena Vista University as teachers and police officers, and they're going to be stakeholders in the community, and they'll be newspaper readers, I'm sure of that. And there's also La Prensa, which we partnered with in the Western Iowa Journalism Foundation. Lorena Lopez serves a lot of Western Iowa and also Des Moines, the state capital, with her publication. And, she really serves the Spanish speaking market very well. But one thing we're actually looking at is podcasts, Spanish language podcasts that can appeal to people with literacy problems. But literacy is a huge issue in Storm Lake, as you might imagine. We're trying to teach Sudanese people English and Latinos, and what's really cool is the kids are teaching each other. And so it's an interesting, the movie is about the newspaper, but it's a really look at a very interesting dynamic going on here.
Yeah, I was going to actually ask you a follow-up question because you did meet with the woman from La Prensa. I'm so sorry, I cannot remember her name at the moment. If you could remind me, Lorena. And you had talked about, kind of a content sharing agreement. Is that something that is happening now, where some of your stories are being told in Spanish in La Prensa, and then some of their stories are being told in English in the Storm Lake Times?
We haven't really started doing that yet. We probably will, I guess. Mainly what right now, we are trying to save the ship from sinking. And we're still coming out of this pandemic. Advertising has not, and I'm convinced will not, rebound A lot of the businesses that we're advertising with just are gone. And so we're focusing entirely, I'm focusing entirely on fundraising at this point, and Lorena is too, actually. And that's, as opposed to sharing content, we're trying to figure out how to share revenue.
Gotcha. Okay. Nate has a question. He asks, do you believe the nonprofit model is the future of local news? What are the downsides and upsides? And I think Victoria and Art might be able to answer this one.
Some form of nonprofit is necessary. We're a hybrid. We have a nonprofit foundation funding for-profit publications, which are actually not profitable. So we might as well be nonprofit, except the nonprofit imposes some restrictions on your expression, and that might have been changed, but the last I knew, for example, you could not endorse a political candidate or a referendum in an election. And to me, that's not worth it. I'd rather go broke than have the government tell me that I can't endorse Joe Biden over Donald Trump when the world is at stake.
Victoria?
Yeah, so I have to say, I think it'll be it's actually already become very, very critical for many media organizations across the country to at least to be able to fundraise from philanthropic institutions, whether or not they're for-profit or nonprofit or hybrid models. There is a bill that is looking to make it easier for-profit organizations to transition to nonprofit status for media organizations to stay afloat. That's actually part of my point that I was making earlier about how we just need an influx of money into that ecosystem, right? We need foundations, wealthy individuals. And in my opinion, Art and I could totally have a debate about this because I spend days debating folks about this, usually in the media industry, but also public funding. And so there are ways to do that to protect editorial independence. It's real, I've seen it, it exists, it's just not easy. But I do think that whether it's nonprofit or hybrid, that is the future, because I like Art, I don't believe that the ad revenue system is going back to what it was in the 20th century. And I don't think we're going to be able to very easily pry money back out of the clutches of Facebook or Google. There are various legislative solutions to try to do that, but it's not going to be an easy road.
Okay.
If I may add, I agree that we do need public funding, and we've gotten public funding since the days of Ben Franklin through the postal subsidy. And but then the subsidy gets so screwed up, as the postal subsidy is now, that it's a yoke all around our neck. And but I would like to make a plug for this tax credit, this refundable tax credit that's in the reconciliation bill. And that's a form of government assistance that it doesn't discriminate, and it's investing in staffing, and also I think it's a 5-year window of sunset, and so, but that would give us a hell of a lot of oxygen to figure out our path forward.
Okay. Gina has a question. She asks, would local news ever consider going to an app/email format? I'd love to support local news companies, but hate wasting paper.
It already is. Almost every newspaper I'm aware of sends out email newsletters of all kinds, including us. We send out a daily email news bulletin. We have an e-edition that you can read online, as again, almost all newspapers do. And you can consume a lot of local news online right now, pretty cheap, less than a cup of coffee a day, $79 at stormlight.com.
Plug. I hear it and I love it.
Got it.
Gina had a follow-up question. She would like to know, would local news consider using social media to promote stories and increase visibility to gain public funding and fundraising for nonprofit?
Well, again, we are, almost all newspapers I know of are using Facebook, Twitter, and a lot are using Instagram right now. I don't know how that, I don't know how these proposals work in Australia, where they're clawing money back from Facebook. I don't trust that money would ever make it back into my pocket. It'll end up in Alden Global Capital's pocket and not mine.
There's
Can
a
I build on
question.
that?
Yes, please go ahead.
I want to
Viktorya.
build on that. So to Art's question about how do you pry the money back out of Facebook and Google's pockets, there's a model that's happening in Australia, which, like Art, I have a deep amount of skepticism towards. And in fact, it's grounded because we're already seeing it play out, just like Art said, where you, every time an article from, let's say, Art's newspaper appears on Facebook or Google have to pay a small amount, like a royalty fee almost, to that paper. That's what the Australia model is trying to do in theory. In practice, it's basically money moving from Facebook and Google to Rupert Murdoch's company, like media conglomerate. Of course, there are some local outlets mixed in there. There's a different model, which was proposed by an organization called the Free Press, which I think is brilliant, which is that you tax ad revenue, you tax the social media companies, not the public, but the social media companies, for the amount of money that they make on ads, which is billions of dollars every year. You put that into a new national endowment for local journalism or some kind of big pool of money, and you allow organizations like Arts to apply for it the way that we as PEN America as a nonprofit institution are constantly applying for foundations and for public funding and for other things to support the work that we do. So that is a different model that I think is a lot more promising, but it hasn't gotten anywhere near the traction that these other conversations of what's happening in Australia and in Europe have gotten way more traction and might be somewhat concerning, frankly.
Art, I would love to actually hear your feedback on that second the second model that Viktorya just shared. Is that something that you think would work in that a majority of journalists would not have an issue with? Because there is an issue with this idea of taking money from the government, because we are supposed to cover the government. So how can we appear unbiased if we are literally gaining money from the people we're supposed to cover?
Yeah, and we've always been taking money from corporate America and towing their line. We know right where the line is, how far you can go without losing that full page ad. And you're always testing that line. So it's nothing new. Again, I'm intrigued by the second idea that Viktorya was talking about, but again, it'll be the little papers like the Storm Lake Times will never get in on those foundation grants. With the exception of maybe the Storm Lake Times and the notoriety, not every newspaper can have a documentary done about them. And, but that's paper of 1,000 circulation in Buffalo Center. They're where Jerry grew up. They're not going to get any grant from any kind of national foundation that clawed back some money from Facebook and Google. I just don't believe they will. I believe it'll go to regional daily newspapers and again end up in the pockets of big corporations. And I don't mean to be a Debbie Downer about it. I just don't trust these superstructures. I do trust the payroll protection program, which saved us. It absolutely saved us from folding. And that's basically what this tax credit we're talking about is, this refundable tax credit. It's kind of a 5-year payroll protection program for the news industry. And we know the payroll protection program worked efficiently and cheaply. That's a fact. There was very little fraud, actually. And this program will work too. And it'll, furthermore, if I may, if we would eliminate health insurance costs and our postal costs, that would solve our problems. That would solve our cash flow problems. But we have this screwed up healthcare system that makes me a health insurance administrator. And then we have this postal system that we're helping third-class mailers compete with us by subsidizing Amazon. And there, I got that off my chest. Those two things would really help us.
Okay. Maya has a question. She asks, how do you grapple with the growing view that all news should be free / a public good?
You get what you pay for.
Short and sweet. Viktorya, did you want to weigh on this too?
The part where I agree with the public good piece is the idea that we cannot assume as a citizenry that journalism will magically happen with no money, which is what I think we sort of, because we couldn't see the way that local outlets were making their money, which was from ads. It's kind of all happening behind the scenes. And for a while, it was working fine for like the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. We're just not used to the idea that it won't happen if somebody doesn't pay for it. And the question is, who is this somebody now, right? And so I think we have to find a balance, because part of the problem in Ashanti, I mean, we haven't really talked about this, but as much as we want to paint a very rosy picture of the service that journalism performs in society, which I deeply believe in, the reality is that there has been a lot of systemic inequality in the way that journalism has worked, and that's playing out aggressively at the local journalism level. And often the communities that get the least access to robust local journalism are low-income communities, rural communities, communities of color. And so that is the piece where I do feel like we have to find ways to make some of this reporting available for free, because some people just can't pay for it, right? But they still need it, and it needs to be happening in our communities and in society for democracy to function.
Right. I think that piece about especially communities of color, you know, when we look at Flint, Michigan, for instance, and, you know, the water issues that they had, you know, a lot of that information would not have come out were it not for local reporting, right? A lot of those people would not have had validation that what they thought was happening to them and their families was actually happening. They weren't crazy, right? And so, you know, when we see all of these smaller news media outlets in these towns shuttering, what that means is that that information doesn't get out. And an entire town can be poisoned and nobody really knows that it's happening. And that's a problem, right? But I do also see the issue, you know, it's interesting how that question was phrased, because it was, you know, shouldn't it be free? It's for the public good. And I think you can do something for the public good while still understanding that journalists need to be paid for the work that they do, right? And I feel like journalism is one of those things where everybody sees journalists, right? But they don't actually know what they do, right? So like with a firefighter, you know what a firefighter does? They fight fires. Cool, got it. I understand what they're being paid for, but we're not necessarily doing a great job of educating the public about what it is that journalism entails and what goes into tracking down a story and doing the research and doing the interviews and putting the piece together so that the public is informed. Beth, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I've been thinking about is, you know, so many of us care about the state of journalism. I mean, Jerry and I now certainly do more than ever before, having made the film. But I do think, like, for example, okay, voter turnout is in decline. Nobody is making the connection. Well, local journalism is in decline. Newspapers are shuttering. People don't know who's running for office. People don't know what the issues are. You know, I don't know that people are really connecting, that we are connecting the dots for the public so that they can come to understand the value of local journalism in their communities and in our society. So I think we become so media illiterate in some ways that many have forgotten, and many don't even know the value that it brings. So I feel like connecting these dots, the gift in some ways of making the film, at least one of the gifts was when we started out making the film, we were like, okay, this is going to be a climate change story. Okay, this is going to be an immigration story. Okay, this is going to be a local business story. But then what we started to understand is how interconnected all those stories are, how, you know, big ag and immigration and climate change, how all of these things are interwoven and connected in Storm Lake, Iowa. And I think that we need to somehow start to show how journalism is interconnected with all of these other aspects of our society so that people understand why it's so important. It's not just important to support local news. We have to kind of perhaps explain and re-educate what we get out of it, because then maybe people will value it more.
We have a question for Beth and Jerry from Alejandra. Was there a specific instance in shooting the film that demonstrated that connection between lack of local news and the state of the country? And that was for Beth and Jerry.
Can you give the text again? I'm so sorry.
Absolutely.
My son just texted me.
No problem. So the question was there a specific instance while you were shooting the film that demonstrated that connection between the lack of local news and the state of the country? Was there a moment where you said, you know what? Ha ha, this is where it starts to degrade?
I might add to that and ask, what were the things, because this is something we were talking about in our report a lot, like where were the moments where you could see these connections in the community that you were making the film about, right? The connections between democracy, civic engagement, holding corporations and governments accountable, et cetera, why it matters.
Jerry, I don't know if you want to, I have a great example while we've been distributing the film actually of that in a way, but Jerry, do you want to?
No, I mean, I was almost going to show the corollary or the counterpoint to that, which I think is celebrating the Storm Lake Times. You know, they were actually out, you know, at the elections. We were with them when they were, you know, out campaigning, and so we saw the positive effects, but we weren't there, and we really didn't show. I mean, it's difficult to show that, I think, because what we were doing was actually profiling a newspaper that actually gets it right. And I think that, you know, by showing that, we're showing what you are actually losing by not having that. So we didn't have instances really where I think that, like, oh, you know, if Art or Tom, if you'd only been, you know, in the courthouse that one night, we might have been able to help on this. So,
But there actually, there was one.
which is,
So in our very first shoot, we were shooting a city council meeting in the town of
good.
Alta, which is the town next door to, it's like the bedroom community of Storm Lake, where a lot of folks work who work
Right.
in Storm Lake. And we were trying to shoot a city council meeting. And there was sort of a tyrannical mayor in place at the time. And he started saying, you don't have permission to shoot here. You can't be here. You can't record this. You have to leave the room.
immediately threw us out. Yeah.
Threw us out.
Yeah.
What was so interesting was that the local sheriff and the local police were there, and they were sort of confounded because they said, you have every right to be here. It's a city council meeting. The press can be here.
Meeting, right.
And it's a public meeting. So it took all of this negotiation for us to get back in the room, and we did. But it was an instance where you saw with, you know, someone who might not have as much sort of bluster or confidence that we had might just back off, and that meeting would not get reported or the outcome of it. But the other piece was that, so it kind of created a scene. And then at the end of that, we had left the city council meeting, and this woman comes out and she comes up to me and she says, well, who are you and what are you doing here? And I said, well, we're making a documentary about Storm Lake through the eyes of the Storm Lake Times. And she said, I'm so happy you're here. She said, because I'm on the school board and we have a crisis in rural America because we don't have enough reporters to tell our stories. She said, the city council meeting and the school board meeting are at the same time in our town, and there's one reporter. And so nobody knows what's going on. And it was so striking. And it was one of those, you know, whenever you're doing these projects, you know, you just have these like light bulb moments. And that was really, you know, one of them. So
If I
that,
may-
yeah, go Art.
Yeah, I'd just like to jump in and I think the movie beautifully or profoundly illustrated what happens when local news is gone. When we were looking into our own grave during the pandemic, and and they were flopping down these newspaper headlines of son Tom hammering on Tyson all the time. How many COVID cases are there? Hammering on the governor's office. What is going on in this state? If we hadn't been there, nobody would have had a clue what was going on in Storm Lake with COVID. And I think that that sort of grim scenario that the documentary presents through those grainy Zoom videos and everything really does. It's kind of like the ghost of Christmas future or something.
And just if I could say one other thing, just about, which is maybe related or not related, but when I was mentioning in distribution, we screened the film at the Hamptons International Film Festival. Now, Storm Lake and the Hamptons, you might think, are kind of opposite, just totally different communities. Now, in some ways, they're not. The Hamptons is a fishing community, farming community, but it is certainly a community of massive wealth. But I guess I just want to say that when we were screening, David Rattray, or after the screening, David Rattray did the Q&A following the film, and then we opened it up to the audience. And then someone said, David, are any of the issues of the film, do they resonate for you? Like, do you worry about ad dollars? And do you see subscriptions declining? And he said, absolutely. And he said, okay, Storm Lake is a one company town with meatpacking. We're a one company town with real estate. And if we publish negative articles about real estate companies, we take a hit, and we've taken a hit. And he just started explaining to all the ways in which there are all these corollaries vis-a-vis Storm Lake, the movie, and the East Hampton Star and its experience in East Hampton on Long Island. And so, I guess what I would just say is, like, that was also a case where I realized, like, wow, it really is kind of illustrating a national story that folks can make their own by screening it. And it showed the way at which journalism can also be perilous. Like, you may report the news, but you might, skin your knee in the process of doing it.
Well, we are getting close to running out of time, but I would love to have everyone on the panel in maybe 20 seconds or less just explain what you hope that viewers get out of Storm Lake once they've watched it tonight, for instance. What do you want people to take away from the documentary when they finish watching it? Why don't we start with Art? We'll go to Beth, and then we'll go to Jerry, and then Viktorya.
Well, I think it's especially timely now that I hope people come away with the idea that we're the last firewall for democracy. And when COVID is bearing down on you, it's the newspaper reporter who's going to be the pain in the ass, who stands up to the governor's office and says, you have to release that data. And right now, when we've got people trying to tear this republic down, quite literally, we're the last line of defense. And it starts in Storm Lake, Iowa. And it leads to Washington, D.C., but the people who stormed the Capitol were from the middle of the country. That's where it starts.
Beth?
I guess I would say that upon watching the film, I hope that viewers stop and think and value their own local news source, that if they're not subscribing, they subscribe. If they're already subscribing, that they up their contribution, or they support their local NPR station or other independent media from whom they receive credible news.
Jerry?
Mostly reiterating what we've already heard, which is, please think about, how these local news sources affect you, how they affect your community. do you want to be part of that community? Do you want to see your community grow, and do that through civic engagement and also through supporting those local news sources, whatever they may be.
And Victoria, the last word.
Thanks. Well, I would say that we are very, very fortunate to still be living in a democracy, as challenged and imperfect as it may be. And democracy works from the ground up, and a free and independent press is absolutely critical for a democracy to function. And I know that coming from the Soviet Union, where we didn't have those things. And so I just want to reiterate what everyone else has said, which is that, you know, freedom isn't free, to quote Art, and also local journalism isn't free. You got to support it. So huge thanks to everyone who was here today. This has just been wonderful.
I do want to echo what Victoria just said. I thank everyone for attending in the middle of the day. I want to thank Victoria, Beth, Jerry, Art for being on the panel this afternoon.
Thank you, Ashanti.
Absolutely. I know we didn't get to one of the questions, but I want to say, if you want to keep the conversation going, you can go on Twitter. You can use the hashtag StormLakePBS to keep that conversation going. You can also go to the website pbs.org/StormLake. Storm Lake premieres tonight, 10/9 Central on PBS. So I encourage all of you to watch it. I've watched it myself. I love documentaries, and this is on the top of my list of documentaries that I have loved this year. So I am very much like the Hollywood Reporter. So again, thank you all for coming. We appreciate your time, and please support your local journalism news media outlets. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
So great.
everyone.